she never went into the water. For 15 long months, an entire island believed she did, and searched accordingly again and again. Lynette Hooker made it back to the boat that night. And according to what federal investigators have now reviewed, she did not walk off it again. So what, exactly, had they all been searching for all that time out there on the open water? The morning air over the Sea of Abaco still held the chill of the night before. Jim Todd stood on the bow of the rescue boat, one hand braced against the rail, the other resting on Brian Hooker's shoulder. Brian's clothes were still damp from the crossing. His voice caught when he raised his arm and pointed. "Right here," he said. "She went over right here." Todd followed the line of his arm out to a patch of open water, unremarkable, the same gray-green as everywhere else around it. Behind them, close enough that Todd could pick out individual rooftops along the shore, was land. He would carry that distance around in the back of his mind for over a year without understanding exactly why it bothered him. Now he understands. Named sources. Confirmed contacts. On the record every single time. This program does not print what it cannot stand behind, and every claim in this episode meets that same exacting standard before it ever reaches you. To understand how a lie survives 15 months, you have to go back further than that morning on the rescue boat. You have to go back to a woman named Lynette, and a boat she once believed in enough to let her husband name it after the one thing she wanted most. If this case matters to you at all the way it matters to this program, subscribe right now. Missing People Files has documented the Lynette Hooker case from the first confirmed report through 14 prior episodes, and what you are about to hear is the darkest turn the story has taken yet. New developments are still arriving. This channel will be the place every one of them is verified and explained. Her family describes her not by what she achieved but by how she made a room feel. She was warm before she was anything else. The kind of warmth that people notice is missing before they can name what changed. She had a stubborn streak, the kind that belongs to a woman who decides something and does not get talked out of it, and friends say that trait is exactly what makes the ending of this story so hard to square with who she was. Every Friday without fail, her phone would ring and it would be her daughter. No occasion, no agenda, just the accumulated ordinary weight of a mother and a daughter checking in on each other's week. It was so routine that neither of them ever thought to treat a single one of those calls as important. Until one of them was the last one and neither of them knew it at the time. She had agreed to a life most people only sketch out in the backs of their minds and never build. Retirement on the water. A sailboat. The Gulf, the Keys, the open Bahamas. She had once walked away from her marriage for reasons her family has described elsewhere in this series, and then, because the history was long, and the hope that things could be different was stronger than the evidence that they would not be, she went back. The boat she went back to was named Soulmate. What was that word supposed to promise a woman who had already been afraid of the man who owned it? And what does it represent now? People who spent time around Lynette and Brian Hooker as a couple describe a specific and recognizable dynamic, the kind that friends of couples like this one often recognize only in hindsight, once it is safe to say it out loud. Lynette was the one who remembered names. She was the one who asked a second question after the first answer, the one who noticed when someone at a dock party was standing alone and went and stood with them. Brian was louder. Brian filled a room the moment he walked into it, told the better version of every story, and needed the room to notice that he had. Neither trait is a crime. But investigators say it is exactly that difference. One partner accustomed to being deferred to, the other accustomed to smoothing things over, that shaped the 4 years the two of them spent living aboard Soulmate together, and shaped what happened the night that arrangement ended. Somewhere between 7 and 7:30 in the evening, Lynette and Brian Hooker climbed down into the dinghy at the Abaco Inn and pushed off into the dark, headed back to Soulmate, anchored a short distance away. That timestamp is not in dispute. It is one of the only things in this entire case that has never changed. What happened after that has never had an honest witness. Until now. For more than a year, the only account of that night came from the one person who survived it to tell it, and for more than a year, an entire community believed him. She bounced off the back of the dinghy, he said. He threw her a green flotation cushion. He called out to her, and the wind carried his voice away before it reached her. The seas were 2 to 4 feet, he said, big enough to explain how two people in the same small boat could drift apart from each other in total darkness. He lost an oar. He had no engine. He floated, helpless, for 4 miles, until the current finally carried him to Marsh Harbor, where he washed up the next morning, marooned, exhausted, and alone, the last man standing in a story that had already claimed his wife. By dawn the island was moving. Radios crackled across Hopetown Volunteer Fire and Rescue's channel before most residents had finished their coffee. Boats launched from private docks in 2s and 3s, engines still cold. Kayaks went out along the mangroves, paddled by people who had never met Lynette Hooker but knew exactly what it meant that she was gone. All-terrain vehicles worked the beaches on foot patrol, scanning a shoreline nobody expected to need scanning on an ordinary holiday weekend. Somewhere out past the reef line, a spotter plane banked low, its engine the only sound for miles in either direction. Everybody who had ever docked a boat in the Abacos, it seemed, put something in the water that week. Their own fuel, their own hours, $7 and $8 and $10 a gallon because a woman was missing, and that is what this community does. Nobody launching that morning knew they were about to spend days searching a stretch of ocean that had nothing to do with what actually happened to her. Everyone expected to find her within days. She was never going to be found. Not because the sea had taken her somewhere the searchers couldn't reach, but because she had never been where they were told to look in the first place. The evidence that finally proved that did not arrive as a single dramatic discovery. It came the way most real investigative breaks come. Piece by piece, witness by witness, until enough small inconsistencies stopped being small. Marine charts and video footage reviewed for this program show conditions on the water that night were calm, not the 2 to 4 foot seas Brian Hooker described to the Hopetown volunteer fire and rescue crew that pulled him out of the water, and not the account he gave to the Royal Bahamas Police Force in the hours after. Investigators say the timeline he provided does not match where the dinghy was ultimately recovered relative to where Soulmate was anchored. And now, according to sources with direct knowledge of the case, there is something far more specific. Physical evidence recovered from aboard Soulmate itself, evidence of a struggle, and evidence consistent with Lynette Hooker having died on that boat rather than in the water behind the dinghy. Sit with what that single detail does to everything that came before it. If Lynette Hooker made it back to Soulmate, what was the dinghy ever actually the scene of? The search patterns flown over open water, the volunteer boats crossing the Sea of Abaco for days, the divers who went down looking for a body that supposedly drifted from a specific set of coordinates. None of it was ever going to find her because the coordinates themselves were manufactured by the one person who knew exactly how false they were. This program has learned that the case has now been formally designated an active homicide investigation, a classification confirmed on the record within the past several weeks. That is not a status any prosecutor assigns lightly. It is not the language investigators use when a person is simply missing at sea. It is the language used when the evidence has moved past accident and into something else. TikTok. Jim Todd is a volunteer firefighter with Hopetown Volunteer Fire and Rescue in the Abaco Islands. He is the man from that morning on the bow of the rescue boat, the one whose shoulder Brian Hooker leaned into, the one who followed his arm out to that unremarkable patch of water. He did not set out to build a case against a man he had helped save. He simply kept noticing things that did not add up, one message at a time. Over more than a year of dozens of text exchanges this program has now reviewed in full. Messages sent, according to the evidence under review, by a man who already knew his wife was dead when he sent them. Told about the new evidence directly, Jim Todd did not react the way this program expected him to. "It's really shocking," Todd said. But given the fullness of time and how many pieces of his original story fell apart bit by bit, it's starting to make complete sense. That reaction deserves to be sat with for a moment. This is a man who spent one of the worst nights of his volunteer career searching for a woman based entirely on coordinates her husband invented. And his first response to learning the truth was not disbelief. It was recognition. Todd was direct about what the news meant for him personally, and for his wife Cindy, also a Hopetown volunteer fire and rescue member who searched alongside him from the first morning. "There's relief in crossing this milestone," Todd said. "With the passage of time, anxiety increases in a certain way. To hear this news is a relief, a sense that we're on a track to finding justice, to identifying what actually happened. Versus when it's quiet and nothing's going on. That's when it feels like treading water." Treading water, the phrase a volunteer rescuer reaches for, unprompted, to describe over a year of not knowing. Nobody on that boat the first morning had any way of knowing the coordinates they were given were false. What none of them could have known is that the man standing among them, accepting their hands and their fuel and their hours, already knew the search would find nothing, because he was the only person who knew where to look, and he had no intention of telling anyone. What is striking, in hindsight, is how few people on that island ever fully believed him to begin with. Todd describes even the most seasoned members of the boating community, the kind of long-time residents who have heard every strange story the sea has ever produced, and who are generally the first to extend the benefit of the doubt to a fellow sailor, as having no illusions about what they were being told. He recalls essentially one person offering the mild defense that the ocean is unpredictable and you never know what might happen out there. Everyone else, in his words, sensed from very early on that something was rotten in the story itself, long before any forensic reconstruction existed to prove it. What does it mean when the people with the most practical hands-on knowledge of that water are the ones least willing to believe an account of it? You would expect a man whose wife had just drowned in front of him to be too shattered by grief to think clearly about anything. That is not the man the text messages describe. The morning after the search began, Brian Hooker texted Jim Todd to apologize for reaching out so late, and then laid out, in careful detail, a hand-drawn route he claimed to have paddled while drifting toward Marsh Harbor Boat Works. A route he said he deliberately steered because he knew a private resort under construction nearby would be empty on the holiday weekend, and a second key further south where, he theorized, his wife might have washed ashore alone. He signed off saying he would be off Wi-Fi with family the next morning and did not want to fall asleep without sending the theory first. Read that message the way an investigator has to read it now. How does a man who claims he was helpless, adrift, and separated from his wife in total darkness produce, within 24 hours, a hand-drawn map of currents, tide tables, and search radii with the specificity of someone who has spent years reading those waters professionally? Jim Todd made the same observation, unprompted. His knowledge of the marine community is clearly lacking, Todd said of Brian Hooker's account of the weather that night, because anybody with half a brain would have known what the winds were that night, what the tides were that night. And that's where his lies began. So which version of Brian Hooker was actually real? The helpless, confused man on the rescue boat, or the one who understood these currents well enough to map them from memory less than a day later? Weeks passed. A green flotation cushion washed ashore roughly 100 yards from where the dinghy had been recovered. Todd found it himself, 3 days into the search, snagged low in a stand of mangrove roots where the tide had wedged it, the fabric gone dark and waterlogged. He waded out, worked it loose, and held it up to photograph against the morning light before he had even climbed back into the boat. His phone buzzed with Brian Hooker's reply before he had gone another 50 yards down the shoreline. Brian's replies read in sequence, do something worth pointing out directly. He asks Todd to send a wider photograph. He asks exactly where along the shoreline it was found. He asks whether Todd can pin the precise coordinates. He asks whether a nearby subdivision, a half-dozen houses back from the water, had been checked. None of those are the questions of a man simply grateful an object connected to his missing wife had turned up. They are the questions of a man auditing how closely the physical evidence matched a story he had already told. When Todd confirmed the cushion was found 100 yards south of the dinghy, and that police had already retrieved it and searched another 300 yards of shoreline before rain stopped the effort, Brian Hooker folded that detail immediately into the same current and coincidence theory he had been building since the first morning. He did not ask a single question about his wife. Then came the message that has stayed with Todd longer than almost anything else Brian Hooker ever wrote him. Incredible to think we floated all that way 100 yards apart. There's nothing incredible about it, Todd told this program. You both go into the water at the same place, the wind is blowing a certain way, you end up in the same place. There's no propulsion involved. It isn't incredible at all. That is not wonder. That is rehearsal. Todd came to understand why Brian Hooker kept circling back to that detail, unprompted, across multiple messages, days apart. This is what criminals do, Todd said. They hammer home details with the people they want to be witnesses to disprove what could be their undoing. They lock it into your mind. What's incredible is that you floated, because you didn't need to float. You manufactured the float. You manufactured the float. Sit with that sentence, because it may be the single clearest description of this entire case that anyone involved in it has offered. Not an accident. Not a tragedy at sea. A story built and re-narrated for the benefit of the exact people positioned to become witnesses for the defense. A volunteer fire crew, a police report, a search log, each one fed a slightly different version of the same lie. There was one more object no one could account for. A black dry bag, the couple's boat keys, their passports, roughly 10 pounds of belongings, that Brian Hooker said had gone into the water with Lynette and was never recovered. Weeks after the search, he texted Todd again, almost as an afterthought. I just realized I didn't answer your question about the green flotation device. I do not know if they recovered it, or do I know if the boat could not make it in to where that smaller boat was. No mention of the dry bag at all, until Todd raised it directly, and even then the answer dissolved into vagueness and was never followed up. What does it mean for that bag to still be missing, if Lynette Hooker made it back to Soulmate and the evidence now shows she never left it again? Where the dry bag went is where Lynette went. Investigators are asking the same question, and unlike Brian Hooker's texts, they intend to get an answer. There is a second thread in these messages that has drawn less attention than it deserves, and it has nothing to do with the dinghy. In one exchange, Brian Hooker told Todd he intended to re-rig Soulmate's windlass. the mechanism that raises and lowers the anchor, so he could operate it single-handed from the helm, without needing anyone else aboard. He framed it as a practical repair, something to fix so he could get back out and help search. What that request actually describes is a man, in the immediate aftermath of his wife's disappearance, modifying the one boat under his control so that he alone could move it without assistance. That is not a detail that proves anything by itself. But it fits without needing to be forced into a pattern investigators say the rest of the evidence already supports. A man preparing to control, alone, the one vessel capable of telling the truth about what happened aboard it. The Coast Guard Investigative Service had agents assigned to this case as early as the middle of April. But it was the second wave, arriving at the end of May, that changed everything. A different mandate entirely, not search and rescue but forensic reconstruction. Jim Todd spent time with them directly during that deployment, and he still describes the day he realized exactly who he was dealing with. His wife Cindy, who holds a doctorate, had stepped away from the group for a moment to take a phone call. Todd was left standing on the dock with 4 or 5 agents in plain clothes, notebooks out, watching the water the way people watch something they are actively taking apart in their heads. One of them looked around, deadpan, and said, "Well, now that she's walked away, we're down to 3 pitches here." Todd laughed at the time. He does not laugh about it now, not because the joke stopped being funny but because of what it told him about who had just arrived on the island. This was not a search and rescue crew. This was a team built to read the water like a document, and Todd understood, standing there, that whatever they eventually found would not be something he could argue with. Criminologist. Forensic specialist. A marine expert whose specific job was reconstructing the wind and tide conditions on the water that night down to the hour, the same reconstruction that has now contradicted Brian Hooker's account of the seas. That kind of reconstruction is not guesswork. It draws on flood tide and ebb tide tables, on wind data logged independently of anything Brian Hooker ever told anyone, and on security and dock camera footage from homes along the shoreline facing where Soulmate was anchored that night. Investigators do not have to take Brian Hooker's word for what the water was doing. They can watch it. That same team's read on Brian Hooker himself was consistent and unflattering. The profile, in Todd's words, of a schemer, someone who believes he is smarter than the people around him and spends his life proving it to himself while everyone else quietly keeps their distance. Todd described the type in more detail than a single conversation usually allows. A manner of speaking that circles back to reassure the listener without ever being asked to, a habit of over-explaining details nobody questioned, an apparent inability to register when people have already stopped believing him. People like that, Todd said, tend to go through life keeping others at arm's length without ever quite understanding why, because on some level, everyone around them has already recognized what he is, long before there is proof of it. Hold that description against a detail that has nothing to do with weather or coordinates. Weeks into the search, in a televised appearance, Brian Hooker broke down on camera describing the ordeal, telling the interviewer it would take a higher power to get him through it. People who have known him for years, including Jim Todd, point out the problem with that sentence without needing to be prompted. Brian Hooker has told people repeatedly over the course of their friendship that he does not believe in God. What does it mean for a man to reach for religious language on camera, in front of an audience he has never once claimed shares his own view of the world? That is not faith surfacing under pressure. That is a performance, calibrated in real time for whichever audience happens to be watching. The same instinct that produced a different version of the dinghy story for Jim Todd, for the Royal Bahamas Police Force, and for the search teams who spent days chasing coordinates he invented. Line those pieces up and look at what they build. A man who claims confusion about tides he can map from memory within a day. A man who manufactures wonder at a drift pattern he engineered. A man who re-rigs a boat's anchor system so he alone can move it. A man who asks for wider photographs and precise coordinates of a cushion but never once asks whether searchers have found any trace of his wife. Any single one of those, alone, could be explained away. Grief does strange things, people cope differently, some men process loss through logistics instead of emotion. It is only in combination, only when a federal forensic team lines them up against a marine reconstruction that contradicts his own account of the weather, that they stop looking like grief and start looking like control. None of this exists in isolation from what this program has already established about Brian Hooker's behavior. In episode 14 of this series, legal analyst Tad Tobias explained a pattern he has observed across dozens of no-body homicide prosecutions. The husband who did it almost never spends real-time searching for his wife, because searching is futile when you already know where the body went. Jim Todd's account confirms that pattern played out in real time, in a detail so specific it is difficult to explain any other way. According to a source who spoke with this program on condition of anonymity, In the weeks after the search was scaled back, Brian Hooker was observed sitting on the same dock in Marsh Harbor every afternoon drinking coffee, while telling people, including Jim Todd, that he was actively trying to hire a boat and a captain to continue searching for his wife. Todd confirmed he personally provided Brian Hooker with the names and phone numbers of 2 captains willing to help. Neither one was ever contacted. A stranger reading only the text messages would call this a devoted husband, checking in with police, updating the embassy, chasing every lead at all hours. In one message, Brian Hooker told Todd he had finally gotten a messaging app working and had just gotten off a call with one of his and Lynette's children, who had begged him for an update. He wrote that he had checked in with police twice, that he had updated the embassy, and that the embassy had been surprised the search was still ongoing, before asking Todd, almost as an afterthought, whether he had any information he could share. Read that message closely. He is not asking whether Lynette has been found. He is asking what the searchers know. Days later, in a separate exchange, he wrote that he had spent an afternoon walking around town looking for a SIM card, that everything had been closed, and that some of his in-laws had just arrived. He mentioned he was thinking about hiring someone to take him to a nearby settlement the next day to continue searching himself. That trip never happened. The in-laws never materialized. Nobody in the community Todd checked with had any record of family members arriving to help. It is the same pattern as the dock in Marsh Harbor. A specific verifiable claim of activity, made to a specific person, that dissolves into nothing the moment anyone checks it against what actually occurred. Say it enough times, in enough different messages, to enough different people, and it starts to sound less like a coincidence of bad luck and more like a man building an alibi, one unverifiable errand at a time, each one small enough that nobody would think to check it in isolation, and each one useless the moment somebody finally did. He asked. He never called. That gap tells you which version of Brian Hooker was real, the one performing urgency in a text message or the one who never picked up the phone. Todd, for his part, said he stopped being surprised by any of it, not because he grew numb, but because he came to understand what kind of person he was dealing with. I'm not mad at the lies he told me, Todd said, because he was always going to lie. My job, and a lot of other people's job, was first to try to find her alive, then to find her body, then to find her remains. We focused on that. What he did to cover it up, that's his problem, and the investigators will get him. Brian Hooker has retained new legal counsel in recent weeks, an attorney with federal criminal defense experience, according to sources familiar with the retention. That is not a detail this program includes to speculate about guilt. It is a detail included because it tells you what Brian Hooker's own legal team believes is coming. You do not hire a federal defense specialist to handle a missing persons case. You hire one to handle an indictment. He also retains, as every American citizen does regardless of what any evidence eventually shows, a Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, a right that becomes considerably more relevant to a person's legal strategy the moment a case moves from missing persons inquiry to active homicide investigation. Why has a man who spent months proactively texting a volunteer firefighter with theories about currents and tides, according to sources close to the case, gone almost entirely silent in the past several weeks? TikTok. The financial and emotional cost of Brian Hooker's fabricated story extends well beyond the two of them, and it deserves to be counted honestly. Hopetown Volunteer Fire and Rescue is not a paid department. It runs on donations, volunteer hours, and whatever fuel its members can afford to burn in their own boats. Jim Todd, his wife Cindy, and their 2 adult daughters alone logged more than 150 hours searching a remote and difficult stretch of coastline, a section of water that fell to them specifically because it was hard to reach and no one else could get to it as quickly. Multiply that number by every other volunteer who responded in boats, on foot, in kayaks, on all-terrain vehicles along the beaches. Add the civilians who were never part of any official crew at all, neighbors who simply went out on their own because they cared, at their own expense, on their own time. Todd estimates the true total easily clears 1,000 hours, and likely several thousand once every independent searcher is counted. Brian Hooker, by every account this program has gathered, did not search for one. That is what a fabricated story costs a community that has no obligation to give anything at all, and gives everything anyway. Todd is careful even now not to frame that cost as bitterness. Volunteer search and rescue, he says, means responding to a call without knowing in advance what it will actually require of you. Sometimes it is less than expected, sometimes it is far more, and the job is to show up regardless of which one it turns out to be. What makes this case different in his telling is not that the call demanded more than they expected. It is that the call itself was never real in the way they were told it was, and no one who answered it had any way of knowing that at the time. He does not describe that as a reason to stop volunteering. He describes it as the reason the organization's integrity matters more, not less. The next time the radio goes off, they will still go because that willingness was never actually Brian Hooker's to take from them, no matter how much of their time and fuel he used up first. What comes next, according to sources close to the case, is expected to move quickly. Investigators are described as finalizing the forensic and testimonial record required to support formal charges, and multiple sources with knowledge of the case describe an indictment as not a matter of if but when. No arrest has been made as of this episode. Brian Hooker has not been charged with any crime, and the presumption of innocence remains his legally, regardless of what the evidence described in this episode appears to show. That presumption will hold until a court says otherwise, and this program will state plainly the moment it changes. What typically separates a probable cause standard from an indictment that can survive trial is not the existence of suspicious behavior. This program has now documented a great deal of that, but the corroboration of physical evidence against testimony from multiple independent sources who were not coordinating with one another. Jim Todd did not know what Blaine Stevenson would say. Blaine Stevenson did not know what the marine forensic reconstruction would show. The Coast Guard Investigative Service was not relying on either man's account when it processed Soulmate. 3 separate lines of evidence, developed independently, are now converging on the same conclusion. That convergence is precisely what a prosecutor waits for before signing an indictment built to last. There is more coming, and it is coming fast. This program has learned that additional Facebook messages between Brian Hooker and a friend of Lynette's, messages this program has independently reviewed, will be the subject of the next episode in this series. That source is Blaine Stevenson, the liveaboard sailor introduced in episode 14, who recorded his own phone call with Brian Hooker in the days after Lynette disappeared and who has remained one of the most consistent on-record voices in this case. Stevenson was, for years, a close friend of Brian Hooker's before the disappearance. The kind of friendship built on shared marina docks and long afternoons spent comparing notes on weather and routes, the ordinary currency of people who live on the water. He does not use the word friend anymore. What he is prepared to share next involves messages sent not to Jim Todd, but directly to people who knew Lynette, and according to sources familiar with their content, they contradict Brian Hooker's public account in ways that go beyond anything covered in this episode. 2 threads are converging now, and it is worth naming both plainly before this episode closes. The first is physical: a boat searched, a device recovered, a marine reconstruction that contradicts the suspect's own account of the weather. The second is human: a widening circle of people Brian Hooker once trusted with pieces of his story: Jim Todd, Blaine Stevenson, the Royal Bahamas Police Force, an entire volunteer fire and rescue organization, each holding a fragment that, alone, could be explained away and that, together, no longer can be. How many separate people did Brian Hooker have to lie to, and in how many separate ways to keep one story standing for over a year? Every fact laid out in this episode traces back to the same through line this program has followed since the beginning, across 14 prior episodes and now this one. A man capable of extraordinary charm, paired with a private willingness to manufacture whatever story a given audience needed to hear, adjusted in real time depending on who was listening. Jim Todd got a version involving currents and coincidence. The Royal Bahamas Police Force got a version involving lost oars and a dead engine. The volunteer search teams got coordinates that sent them into open water for days, chasing a woman who had already been gone from that water before the first boat ever launched. What none of those audiences got was the truth. TikTok. And the truth, according to sources with direct knowledge of the case, is this: Lynette Hooker made it back to the boat she and her husband named Soulmate, the boat they had shared for 4 years, the boat that was supposed to mean exactly what its name said. There is now evidence that she died there. Not in the water behind a dinghy that was never the scene of anything at all. Jim Todd, who has spent more hours than almost anyone else in this case searching for a woman based on a lie, put it in terms this program has not been able to improve on. "I don't have any control over what Brian Hooker did," Todd said quietly. "Any way that we were misled was his action, not ours. We just did our job the best that we knew how to do." They did their job. 150 hours from one family alone, easily more once every volunteer is counted, searching water that never held the answer, because the man who sent them there already knew it wasn't there to find. Every one of those hours was real. Every one of those hours was also, in the coldest sense, wasted by design. Strip away the tides, the coordinates, the marine forensics, the forensic PhDs on the dock, the federal defense attorney, all of it, and what this case has always actually been about is a woman who is still missing. Lynette Hooker's daughter, Carly, introduced earlier in this series, has spent more than a year building her own independent timeline of that night, retracing routes, reviewing surveillance footage, asking questions investigators have not always been able to answer on her timetable. Every piece of evidence described in this episode is a piece Carly has been waiting for, whether or not she has been told the details yet. She calls the number that used to ring through to her mother's voice and gets nothing. She has a family that has waited more than a year for a word that keeps almost arriving and never quite does. She has a community of volunteers in a small island fire and rescue organization who search for her mother as if she were their own, because that is what that organization does, and who now know that the search itself was staged for them before it ever began. What does justice look like for a family in a case like this one? Not the arrest alone. Not even the indictment whenever it comes. Justice for a family in Carly's position starts with something smaller and harder to guarantee than either of those. The truth about which boat her mother was actually on when she died, spoken plainly on the record by the people whose job it is to say it. Everything else, the sentence, the appeals, the years of legal process still to come, happens after that first fact is finally settled, not before it. A grave can be built around an indictment. It cannot be built around a rumor, or a story a man kept changing depending on who was listening. Carly does not need the story anymore. She needs the fact underneath it. If you are able, this program asks you to consider giving to Hopetown Volunteer Fire and Rescue directly. They are a volunteer organization, funded entirely by donations, and every dollar goes toward fuel, equipment and maintenance for the boats that will answer the next call, whatever it turns out to be. The resources spent searching for Lynette Hooker on the strength of a fabricated story were resources this community did not have to spare and gave without hesitation, without asking first whether the story they were told was true. That kind of integrity does not ask to be repaid. It deserves to be anyway. If you know anything about the disappearance of Lynette Hooker, about what happened aboard the vessel Soulmate, or about Brian Hooker's movements in the hours after he says his wife went into the water, contact the Royal Bahamas Police Force or the United States Coast Guard Investigative Service directly. Every detail matters. Every detail in this episode was verified the same way every detail in this series always has been: named sources, confirmed contacts, on the record. Subscribe to Missing People Files for the next chapter in this case, arriving soon, when Blaine Stevenson shares what Brian Hooker wrote to the people who knew Lynette best. This program will keep following this case exactly the way it always has, until Lynette Hooker's family has the one thing no story, true or fabricated, has been able to give them yet: an answer.